Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1940, on the 10th of February, Soviet troops begin breaking through the Mannerheim Line in Finland. On the 12th of February, the Finnish cabinet authorises the government to seek peace with Moscow. Australian and New Zealand troops arrive in Egypt, and on the 13th of February, Finland unsuccessfully asks Sweden for troops to fight against the Soviet Union. In 1941, on the 9th of February, the British forces capture El Bela. Churchill halts the British advance in North Africa and begins withdrawing troops for Greece. François Darlan becomes Vice President of the Council of Vichy France. On the 10th of February, the Luftwaffe bombs British-held Iceland. Britain severs diplomatic relations with Romania due to the presence of 500,000 German troops in the country. On the 12th of February, Mussolini meets Franco at Bordighera in another attempt to persuade Spain to join the Axis, and Erwin Rommel arrives in Libya. On the 13th of February, German authorities order all Gentiles to leave Amsterdam's Jewish quarter. On the 14th of February, the first units of the Afrika Korps arrive in Tripoli. And Hitler meets with Yugoslav Prime Minister Dragiša Ševeković at the Berghof, but is unable to convince Četković to sign on to the Tripartite Pact. In 1942, on the 10th of February, the Battle of Kranji in Singapore ends in Japanese victory. On the 11th of February, German warships launched the Channel Dash from Brest to break the British blockade. On the 14th of February, the Japanese invasion of Sumatra begins. The Battle of Panjir Panjang in Singapore ends in Japanese victory, and the Battle of Billion River begins in Burma. The British Air Ministry issues the Area Bombing Directive, and on the 15th of February, the Singapore garrison surrenders to the Japanese army. In 1943, on the 9th of February, President Roosevelt issues an executive order establishing a minimum wartime work week of 48 hours in 32 American cities. On the 10th of February, the Battle of Timor ends in Japanese tactical victory. The 13th Waffen-SS Division begins recruiting troops in Croatia, primarily from the Bosnian Muslim community. And Mohandas Gandhi starts a hunger strike in jail in the Aga Khan Palace in Pune, where he had been held since August 1942 at the start of the Quit India campaign. On the 11th of February, the Soviet Union begins its nuclear weapons research program. On the 13th of February, the U.S. Marine Corps Women's Reserve is created, and on the 14th of February, the Battle of Sidi Bouzid begins in Tunisia. In 1944, on the 9th of February, the Bishop of Chichester, George Bell, starts a debate in the House of Lords about the morality of bombing European cities, and on the 13th of February, the US declares neutrality in the border dispute between Poland and the Soviet Union. In 1945, on the 9th of February, the Battle of Zimba Ridge on Bougainville Island ends. On the 10th of February, the Battle of Hürtgen Forest ends in German defensive victory, and the German passenger liner General von Steuben is torpedoed and sunk in the Baltic Sea with a loss of more than 4,000 lives. On the 11th of February, the Yalta Conference concludes. Operation Veritable ends in Allied victory, and the 1st Canadian Army captures Cleve in the heart of the Siegfried Line. On the 12th of February, the Treaty of Varkiza is signed, calling for the Greek resistance to disarm and relinquish control of territory it occupied in exchange for recognition, free elections, and the removal of Nazi collaborators. On the 13th of February, the bombing of Dresden begins. The Budapest offensive and the siege of Budapest ends, and the siege of Breslau begins. Well, there we are. We've gone through the second week of February, effectively, in every year of the war, 1940 to 1945. And we've got a number of talking points, but we'll be mainly focusing on the Singapore story now. To deal with that, I'd like to bring on stage my co-host, Dr. Joe Quinn, in Darlington again, I see.
Yes, I'm in Darlington, northeast, which is very wintry today. A lot of snow flurries or sleet flurries. And I'm just currently doing a little bit of dog sitting of a baby cockapoo on my lap. You can't see her at the moment, but she's fast asleep in a blanket.
Well, dogs are always very popular, so if we run out of topics, we could always bring the dog on.
Yeah.
So, Joe, there you are, a number of dates. Let's go straight away to the Singapore story. I've got a couple of slides. We'll talk about other dates, but let's talk about the Singapore story because it's, a seminal moment for the British Empire. Anyway, I know it's not just about him, but there you are. Let's just get it out of the way because he was the general officer commanding of the Malaya Command at the time that Singapore fell. That's Arthur Percival. There he is. Famous for his overbite. Not an entirely conventional senior British Army officer. He was born in Hertfordshire in 1887, but he did not join the British Army. He enlisted in 1914 when he was 27, as in the enthusiasm for war. And he quickly was made an officer, awarded the Military Cross during the Somme battles in September 1916, and then at the end of the war, Distinguished Service Order, and he was promoted to Major. And post-war, he had quite a distinguished record, and he became really quite well known as being a promising officer. He served in Russia, in Ireland, in the British, in the War for Independence, in West Africa. He was at Staff College, and he was in Malaya in the 30s and went to Malta. And then in April 41, he was promoted to acting Lieutenant General and appointed General Officer Commanding in Malaya. Mm-hmm. So he's the unfortunate chap who had the responsibility, and I'll just put that map up and we can discuss some of the detail. The Malaya campaign, it all started on the 8th of December with the landings. If you look at the map there, you can see that the Japanese landings right up in the northeast in Thailand and Malaya. So by the 31st of January, the last British and Commonwealth Imperial troops are withdrawn to Singapore Island, right down the bottom of the screen. I don't think you can quite see it. So it was an amazing summit. Well, it was at this point, it was less than 60 days, less than 2 months, and they had been forced back by the Japanese. We discussed that in the past. Singapore Island. So 8th of February is when the Japanese started their landings on Singapore Island. The single causeway you can see linking the mainland with Singapore Island had been blocked, but the Japanese landed and very, very rapidly defeated the British Imperial and Commonwealth troops. And this all led eventually to the decision to surrender. This is one of the most famous photographs ever taken in the history of the British Empire, and that is the Percival, I think he's on the right there, and not carrying anything, and they got 2 officers carrying a white flag and the United Kingdom flag, and famously the guy with the white flag drops it. They surrendered, and they were all imprisoned, including, of course, Percival. And the story of the campaign can be summed up one of the greatest disasters, probably the greatest disaster in British imperial history. In Singapore, 85,000 British, Indian, and Commonwealth troops were captured. About 5,000 men were killed or wounded in the battle for Singapore Island itself. The majority of those were actually Australian. The Japanese casualties in the fighting in Singapore were significantly less than that, so around the same, about 5,000. But in the whole campaign, 17-day campaign in Malaya and Singapore, total Commonwealth casualties were 9,000
9,000 killed and wounded, and but 130,000 captured. An absolutely tragic story was about to begin. And the Japanese casualties, 10,000. So a tremendous victory for the Japanese army, an historic moment. And I think that will do for the moment. So let's get on to the. So Joe, I mean, I am right there on that the 15th of February. So that is 84 years ago this weekend. The greatest defeat, is it the greatest defeat in the history of the British Empire? And certainly I think most people regard it as marking the end of the British Empire. 1939, the British Empire spanned the world. And despite the weakening of the First World War and the economic problems, it still was an incredible force. But in 1942, this happened. Psychologically, it was disastrous. So by the late 1960s, the British Empire was effectively history. So am I wrong on that, Joe? Would you say I'm right?
No, I mean, the general consensus on the fall of Singapore on the 15th of February 1942 is this was a major turning point in the Second World War. Despite the fact that this was a victory of the Japanese inflicted against the Allies at a very crucial point when the Japanese were in the process of advancing in multiple directions around what we know as the Far East, East Asia, in various different directions, and into the southwestern Pacific and towards India. Singapore was a key nodal point. It was a critical nodal point in terms of both Britain's defences and also in terms of trade routes. The Straits of Malacca are absolutely vital to global trade, especially today. And Singapore controls the reason why the British had a colony there in the first place, and created essentially the city was because of the fact that it was a very, very significant outpost in terms of safeguarding British and European trade routes in that particular part of the Far East. It was also considered to be a significant defensive point within Australian regional strategy. But they realized they lost a division, the 8th Division, Australian Division, was surrendered at Singapore. Many of them felt that they hadn't put up a proper fight. Many had, but there are many elements within the division that didn't actually have a proper go in terms of essentially seeing off the Japanese, and they felt that they were very poorly coordinated by their high command. But it was a turning point in the sense that, one, it was signified as basically the end of British dominance within that particular region of the world. It was felt that even despite the fact that the British established a colossal Pacific fleet in the years that followed, which aided the American fleet in their Pacific operations, and it was a very, very gigantic, powerful fleet. As a task force, the British Pacific Fleet was the 4th largest in the world. It was a massive force by the end of the war. But the fact of the matter is that by the time that Singapore had fallen, British power in that region had effectively been eclipsed from a symbolic point of view. The fall of Singapore was the worst disaster and the largest capitulation to ever take place in the whole of Britain and its global history. And really, it was basically like a psychological blow from which, in many respects, the British never really recovered. And they were sort of relegated after the fall of Singapore to being sort of a second-rate global power, because, I mean, the Americans suffered a comparable defeat with the fall of the Philippines, but the Americans hadn't assumed the status of a major global power at that particular point in the war. And, you know, the surrender of Lieutenant General Arthur Percival to General Tomoyuki Yamashita was one that, you know, sort of it signified sort of there was a sort of a growing feeling that the British general staff was largely incompetent. The British commanders really didn't have the pluck or the nerve or the talent to seek an honourable victory in the field against their foes. There had not yet been a major British victory, a significant British victory beyond the Battle of Britain, particularly not on the field. They had not yet experienced a land victory. And, a lot of the prisoners of war that were taken at Singapore that later end up at work camps throughout Thailand, working on the Thai-Burma Railway, and forced to endure horrific conditions. This is a very well-known story. Word got to some of these prisoners about the victory at El Alamein, and also the fact that the church bells back home in England had rung for an entire day. It was the first time since the war began that basically the church bells throughout the land had won. And the morale-raising effect within those camps under those horrific conditions of hearing about this victory. Finally, our boys managed to win a victory over the Axis forces, was a huge lift for these men who were languishing in these horrible, sort of mosquito-ridden prisons where there was no stockade, no barbed wire, as the line goes in the bridge in the River Kauai. Basically, they're just surrounded by a dense, impenetrable jungle with nowhere to run. And what happens at Singapore, and I could talk about it all afternoon, all evening. But what happens at Singapore really is Yamashita is gambling. He advances through Malaya, and it's a very speedy advance. It's mainly attacks and assaults along the coastal areas, both in eastern and western Malaya. And they end up just outrunning and outflanking the British at every turn. And the British are racing to a retreat. There are battles at particular points in Malaya, but in the places where they hold out, they find themselves being outflanked. And the Japanese are moving very rapidly. They're on bikes. It's a largely an infantry-led sort of invasion or advance, backed up by quantities of motorized units and armor and basically accompanying, artillery support. But it's mainly just Japanese infantry with basically mortar teams, basically advancing very rapidly on bicycles, which they basically steal from all over Indochina, from French-held Indochina, and they effectively appropriate the equivalent of about maybe 1 million bicycles in order to bring that army down. And it's effectively a victory. The capture of Malaya is a victory that is won on the saddle of a bicycle with an Arisaka rifle slung over your back. That's really it. But here's where we're getting to the crucial point. At the point that they were advancing on Singapore Island, and particularly when they landed in the south, and then when Japanese forces managed to cross over what was left of the causeway and also managed to go across the lagoon towards Singapore Island. So they hit it from two sides, the south first and then in the north. And the British defenders didn't really anticipate that the Japanese would land where they would said they would land. And they were under this impression that Singapore and the island and the city itself was impregnable, that the defenses, which, the imperial defense committees, that were in charge of preparing various different parts of the empire, getting them ready for war, they invested a huge amount in terms of upgrading Singapore's defense with coastal artillery batteries and also essentially the fortresses within Singapore city itself. These large fortresses with huge magazines filled with ammunition. But the Japanese just end up outwitting and outflanking and outmaneuvering the British at every turn. And the fundamental gamble is as follows. As Yamashita was advancing towards Singapore city, his men's ammunition supply, the ammunition reserves, and when ammunition, I'm not talking about more or tanks, talking about rifle and machine gun ammunition for the infantry. That supply was running critically low. They had, in some places, they had less than 24 hours worth of ammunition left, whereas the British had enough ammunition to hold out for a month and a half. Now, whether Percival could have rallied his forces or whether his commanders underneath him could have rallied their forces and basically organized a proper, determined defense remains to be debated. But if you read any of the reports of what was going on in Singapore, in the city and on the island itself, one of the things that's very clear is that the shock and the panic of the envelopment that the Japanese was orchestrating of British forces took people by such surprise and led to such a loss of faith in their high command and in their own commanders. And there was a feeling of disorganization and a lack of proper coordination that basically what happened was soldiers more or less gave up. They didn't really know how to respond psychologically to what was taking place. It was rather terrifying. And many people, many citizens inside Singapore City did not actually fully understand what was waiting for them. And I'm just going to finish this point. If I was really going to be daring, I probably would have invited on a 96-year-old woman who's a religious sister based in West London. And the reason I would have, her name is Sister Christine Charwood. And the reason I would have invited her on was because she was actually there. She was a young girl in Singapore. Her father was a copper and tin merchant. He worked for an old firm that had been based in Singapore since the late 19th century. And he was doing very well for himself. And he lived in an affluent neighborhood in Singapore. And Christine grew up with the daughter of the housemaid. And that daughter, who was the same age, and she was her best friend coming up. But what happened was Christine's brother was in the brother-in-law was in the Australian Army. Her father was basically a businessman working in the city. And on the night of the 13th of February, the senior Royal Navy officer commanding the port in Singapore arrived in the house and came into the parlor and spoke in a very hushed voice to her father. And he said, I just wanted to come and tell you, this is absolutely top secret, but I just want to let you know that tonight we were blowing up the harbor docks so that the Japanese can't use it. Get your women out now. There are 2 ships waiting in the harbor. These are the last ships out of Singapore. Tell them to pack their belongings and get down there in the next hour because they won't be able to get off after that. And her father immediately got her mother and herself together, and they packed one suitcase. He dropped them down to the harbor, and they boarded a ship called the Empress of India. And they sailed out from the harbor early that morning, on the morning of the 14th of February, under heavy Japanese bombardment and with Japanese dive bombers descending down upon them, raining bombs down upon them. And somehow, miraculously, the Empress of India managed to make it out of the harbor without being sunk, despite coming under heavy assault. And it was overloaded. We were talking about the William Gustave, the sinking of that ship with all the civilians on board. This ship was absolutely rammed with civilians from Singapore escaping the fall of Singapore. It was literally the last ship out. And Sister Christine was on board that ship, and she sailed out of Singapore under heavy attack, and didn't see her father or her brother-in-law until after the war. Her sister stayed behind because she wouldn't leave, because her husband, her brother, Christine's brother-in-law, was a serving army officer. But her sister somehow managed to escape Singapore, and she made her way with there was a trail of civilians that got out of Singapore, and they made their way across, Sumatra, Indonesia, and all the way down towards Papua New Guinea, towards Australia. So there was a small trail. There might have been 1,000 civilians and people that managed to get away from Singapore that made their way to northern Australia. Maybe about a month later, they arrived on the shores of Australia. And so her sister miraculously managed to make that journey and survive it. And when she arrived in Australia, she enlisted in the Australian Army as a nurse and served with the Australian Army as a military nurse all the way basically through to the end of the war. And the family were eventually reunited. But Sister Christine was there. And one of the things she said, and this is my final point, is that people in the city were absolutely unaware of what was about to unfold, what was about to happen to them, until literally less than 36 hours before the city actually fell and Percival signed the surrender order. They were completely unaware that the Japanese were absolutely about to take over the entire city, and that essentially the British were on the verge of collapse until it was literally upon them and the Japanese were at the gates. So it's hard to overemphasize the level of terror, the level of panic, and the level of malaise. It's all happening. What happens in Singapore is really, it's a nightmare, particularly within the British consciousness. Probably just something that I think, sort of the mythical stiff upper lip and that whole mentality. This is something that they're completely ill-equipped to deal with on a psychological and an emotional level. And certainly this is probably one of the big reasons why the fall of Singapore is such a significant blow to the British imperial mindset. And really, in a symbolic sense, more than anything else, it really does. This event in history signifies the end of the British Empire.
Yes, I think that is something that I don't think anybody can or should dispute, although it doesn't get the kind of attention. That this date, 15th of February, was really this pivotal moment in world history for that reason. We discussed the failings of the military campaign. I mean, there you are. I don't think we can go much further on that. Percival is generally, in hindsight, was mocked, but of course, I'm not sure what else he could have done, and he suffered terribly as a prisoner in Formosa and then in Manchuria. He was released, and I think he was ever the same person. He died pretty early. When he was 71.
One thing I just wanted to come in and say briefly about Percival is that Percival was probably B-list in many respects as a commander, but I suppose in some respects he was drawing the short straw. So Percival is, in that photograph, Percival is the British officer on the, I was just about to say extreme left. It's actually the right of the photograph, but it's the left of the procession. So his deputy is carrying the British flag just beside the escorting Japanese officer. And actually that's a still taken from the footage of them marching down from the hilltop headquarters. There's a fortress on the hill, and they make this march down the roadway. And what happens is a few frames more after that particular still, essentially as they are approaching the camera, a Japanese soldier or officer, a young Japanese officer, essentially steps in and literally grabs the Union Jack off the officer and just flings it to the ground. So there's a sort of an act of notable violence, a sort of so they allow them their dignity in terms of their procession down to the bottom of the hill, but the minute they arrive, literally the Union Jack is snapped off them and basically thrown on the ground in a symbolic gesture of contempt. Is very much symbolic of, the Japanese contempt for those who surrender, because the Japanese follow the Bushido Code, which is a code of honor that basically it's sort of it's a counterpoint to Western chivalry. It's the whole notion that basically you do not surrender, you fight until the death, and if you surrender, you should take your own life in a ritualized custom. The Japanese warrior samurai code, they can't really make an account for the cultural difference that allows for these Britishers and for the Americans and for other Europeans that are surrendering to them. They can't really make an allowance for the fact that surrender can also be done in an honorable sense. That's not to say that the soldiers who are surrendering and are being surrendered don't feel tremendous shame and shock at what is taking place. But with regard to Percival himself, there were a lot of Irish soldiers, at least 1,000, that were serving in Singapore in the British Army, 1,000 that we know of, including those who came from very Republican families. And there were one or two that didn't really have much time for Percival. They were very resentful of having Percival as a commanding officer. And the reason for this is as follows. Percival, when he served in Ireland, was a battalion commander. He was a major, and he was the battalion commander of a battalion of the Essex Regiment in West Cork. And the Essex Regiment were almost as bad as the Black and Tans in terms of their reputation as they were regular soldiers, but they were, in terms of regular troops fighting in the Irish War of Independence, they had a shocking reputation, burned a lot of people's houses, shot people out of hand, horrific violence. And Percival himself was known to have overseen that, and that was regarded as fairly bloody-minded by his opponents, Tom Barry and the West Cork the West Cork Brigade and the West Cork Flying Column. They were Percival's opponents, and they regarded him as an absolute savage. And so his reputation in Cork was certainly not one to be desired. He was regarded as a bit of a brute, and he let his men off the leash. So he did not have a very good reputation in Ireland. Bernard Montgomery, by comparison, had a much finer reputation, even though he was a major serving in that conflict, just like Percival was, but was regarded as altogether more humane in spite of his contempt for Irish Republic Army irregulars. So when Percival was serving out in Singapore, and when he surrendered those soldiers, including those Irish soldiers basically serving with the British Army, they had nothing nice to say about him. And I think one soldier, one veteran, recounted that even though I was horrified to find myself being handed over to Japanese captivity, I was still a little bit smug about the fact that at least Percival got his nose rubbed in proverbial doo-doo. So there was no love lost between Percival and some of the men that he commanded, particularly not the Irish contingent that were serving out there.
Well, that's the total figure. It is shocking, the number that were taken prisoner. But the photograph here, another famous photograph of an officer surrendering hands up, that is the Suffolk Regiment. And the Suffolk Regiment, the battalion of the Suffolk Regiment, was almost completely, the whole battalion was taken prisoner. And to an extent, that formation kind of inspired the story of the Bridge of the River Kwai, because if you see the story of the Bridge of the River Kwai, Alec Guinness is the commanding officer, and he's got an intact battalion. You know, they say battalion. So he's talking about a formation that was forced to surrender. I mean, they were told to surrender and were taken into to prison. They had no idea. I'm sure Percival had no idea the way they were going to be treated and the mortality rate that would follow. Of course, the other element of this story is, so that's the British, the effect on the psychology of the British Empire, the weaknesses of the British command structure. You can point out the weaknesses of the officers as well. But an issue which the ramifications, first of all, let's talk about Australia briefly, because John Curtin had been made Prime Minister the previous autumn. John Curtin, we like to get Ireland into this story. So John Curtin is an Irish Australian, leader of the Labour Party. I think he was actually born in Ireland, or not his parents were.
I'm not too sure whether he was born in Ireland, but I believe the family connection is Tipperary. I believe that's
he came up in a way that the Australian politics, at least initially, was the Labour Party was dominated by Irish migrants. So he was leader of the Labour Party, became Prime Minister, John Curtin, and he immediately started asserting that Australian troops need to be pulled out of the Mediterranean, where they had been fighting in the Western Desert, and they need to be brought back to Australia to defend the homeland. Yeah. And one of the issues was, as the I think it was the 7th Division, as it was being shipped back from the Middle East, Churchill was trying to divert it to Burma.
Absolutely, to Burma, yeah.
And Curtin said, "Not me, it's not happening." And the row went on until eventually Curtin got his way. Yeah. And he made a statement, I'm not sure when it was, but it's certainly early in 42, in which he said, regardless of sentimental attachments to the United Kingdom, and there you go, an Irish Australian, sentimental attachments to the United Kingdom, that we see our future as being in partnership with the United States.
Yeah. And I just wanted to come in on that point. It's an excellent point. There's a very good movie about this, by the way. So, I think the actor, it's Ian McInnes or whatever. He played an outback copper, Australian copper, in a 1990s series, and he was a very well-known Australian actor in the 1990s. But Ian McInnes was in the movie Kokoda that was made. It was made in 2005, where he reenacted the role of an Australian officer giving a famous oration.
Yes.
And we'll do this at another point about the Battle of Kokoda and Isarava on the Kokoda track, and the incredible, gritty, basically resistance that the Australians put up, which is this. We need to get Carl James speaking about this, because this is, and he'll be delighted to guide us through. He did tell me that he'd be delighted to talk us through the campaigns in Papua New Guinea that the Australian, the AIF units that were pulled out of the Middle East by Curtin, that they fought in Papua New Guinea against the Australians on the Kokoda track. But Ian McGinn, in addition to being in the movie Kokoda, playing that small, it was kind of like a cameo role where he reprised the speech, and it's incredibly moving. It doesn't matter what nationality you are, you'll be in tears by the end of the speech. He also reprised the role of John Curtin in a sort of I think it was an Australian Broadcasting Corporation drama. And in it, it all takes place during the timeline of the attack on Pearl Harbor, basically the Japanese entering the war, the fall of Singapore. All of this is coming through in real time, and the crisis at the heart of government in Australia, and Curtin's efforts to get the boys. The withdrawal, and it's a very famous episode in Australian history, because what Curtin does is, after the fall of Singapore, he basically sits down and he essentially says, I'm thinking that we need to withdraw our troops from the Middle East. And no, it's Middle East, North Africa, but at the time they said Middle East. That's where they thought, that's how they referred to that particular theater. And they start pressing for it very hard, because they realize that they have at least two, the 6th and 7th Australian divisions, two battle-hardened divisions that have fought the enemy, they fought the Italians, they fought the Germans, and they know they're going to need them back in Australia and in New Guinea to face the Japanese. And they've already lost two divisions. They lost the 8th Division in Singapore and Malaya, and they've lost the 9th Division, but the better part of an entire Australian division was lost on the island of Crete. So they've given two divisions, sacrificed two divisions for the Imperial War effort. And from their perspective, they're not really getting much bang for their buck. So they're making, and it's historic, a unilateral decision to withdraw their soldiers from the Imperial War effort for their own defense. And yes, as you say, Eddie, they are tying their colors to an American mast. And the Americans are moving in. They start moving into Australia in force in very large numbers. By the end of 1942, there's probably something in the region of about 200,000 Americans, including support personnel, Air Force, and so on, and naval personnel in Australia. And they've withdrawn their own troops as well. And they start fighting together as coalition partners. And arguably, the first coalition partnership that takes place with the Americans and the British Commonwealth doesn't take place between the British and the Americans. We always think of the British and the Americans fighting as coalition partners. No, it all began with the Australians. The Australians and the New Zealanders are the first to fight alongside the Americans in an integrated sense as coalition partners. There's even instances where American paratroopers are dropped in certain areas, and they basically bring in gliders and they fly in Australian Army artillery units within American gliders to provide the artillery support for the American parachute infantry regiments that are parachuting into New Guinea. So they we're talking about combined arms operations involving both armed forces. They're literally fighting side by side, cheek by jowl, and this is the new partnership. And the Aussies have been partnered effectively with the Americans ever since. They're still connected with the mother country. They're still in the Commonwealth. There's still a very strong connection with the UK, but they are even more strongly intertwined with the United States as a result of a partnership that was built up after the fall of Singapore, and it was John Curtin who made that call.
Yes, and of course General MacArthur, who flees Philippines in March 1942.
Yeah,
he goes to Australia, so he's based in Australia for the rest of the war until he goes to the Philippines, and that's another chapter of the story in which the relationship between the Australians and the Americans becomes dominant. Of course, the Australians sent formations to the Vietnam War, something the United Kingdom didn't do, but the Australians did. as well as other places. And the New Zealanders, interestingly enough, although the New Zealanders were having the same feelings about our boys being over in Europe and North Africa, nevertheless maintained an entire division which fought in the Italian campaign to the end. Although they did, there were problems, morale problems, no doubt about it, in Italy. But we can come to that to another stage. Now, the second political dynamic, of course, is India, because the majority of the men who were actually surrendered by the British Army in Singapore, by personnel in Singapore, were from the Indian subcontinent. I think it's the majority, the largest number. And as soon as the surrender took place, the Japanese called the British, the officers who were running the Indian Army. I think they separated the British officers and the British formations, so they just had men, officers, and other ranks who were from the Indian subcontinent, and they put them in a parade ground, and a picture was made to them by somebody who was an Indian, who said, "Let's all join together to fight for the ejection of the British from India." And I think the majority of the Indian soldiers who were paraded that day actually signed up for, to fight with the Japanese. And we saw in the pre-record that Gandhi launched the Quit India campaign later in 42. So the connections are there. Singapore falls, the Indian National Congress launches the Quit India campaign to try and get the Indian self-government in India in August in 42, later in 42. Gandhi is arrested and put in prison. So you've got the subtext taking place in India, which is another crisis point for the ability of the British Empire to survive. I don't think there's any question about that. It's now the third element of the story, which doesn't get anywhere near enough attention, is the Singaporean people themselves. Because the state of Singapore, an independent state, very successful, member of the United Nations, very well regarded, it commemorates the 15th of February as a national public holiday in commemoration, because this was a moment, a start of great suffering for the people of Singapore, and specifically the Japanese targeted the Chinese population. And I think people are aware that Singapore was created as a port essentially by Raffles, a British merchant, and the Chinese population in Singapore, very influential. They were brought in as labor and traders, so they were brought in by the British, and the British worked with up to a point with the Chinese population, but the Japanese came in, they targeted the Chinese with a racist eugenic approach, which they applied elsewhere. And tens of thousands of Singaporean Chinese, other Singaporeans were killed. And this was a traumatic moment, and it shaped, again, another new national independence movement in the post-war period. Lee Kuan Yew became the first head or Prime Minister of independent Singapore, Cambridge University graduate from the Chinese family. His family is still very influential, and that's a Chinese community that was traumatized by the Japanese occupation. So the fissures, the aftershocks of this moment just went on. It affected the whole Pacific strategy, America, Australian Pacific policy, but it also shaped to an extent what happened in India after the war with independence for India, Pakistan, and other nations of the subcontinent. But it also helped define the character of Singapore as we know it today. I mean, so. Is that the full house? Have I got everything, Joe?
Well, actually, it's interesting that you should mention the Singaporean Chinese population. So you've given a very good outline of their historical antecedents. And of course, Singapore, in many respects, is considered to be sort of kind of a culturally Chinese city. There are, of course, there are Indian, or South Asian, I should say, elements within that population, very strong, possibly 30-40%. And there are other elements too, but Singapore is primary. They're from all over the world. There's obviously a lot of white, sort of people of Anglo-Saxon or British descent that are Singaporean citizens. So it's a multiracial, multi-ethnic population. But the core element of that population is Singaporean Chinese, the descendants of those Chinese migrants that were brought out to work effectively as laborers. And it was originally the intention that they'd use South Asian laborers, but the Chinese were considered to be more effective, more industrious, and they very quickly formed effectively the core of really what became a middle class in Singapore. And they were really competing, I think, with their white British overlords for pole position in terms of the governance of that of that country, of that colony post-war. And that's exactly what happened. But one of the things I should point out is that there was a subversive element within that colony, which was communist. Now, they wouldn't really have been Maoist communists. There was an element among communist supporters, Chinese communist supporters within Singapore, that probably would have adhered to certain elements of Mao's, but so many of them had kind of mainstream socialist communist views, more influenced probably more by Stalinism or Leninism or Marxist Leninism, if you like. So more kind of a more European oriented type of communism as opposed to the Asian variant of communism that was basically been developed by Mao in China. So it wasn't a uniform brand, but it was nonetheless the leading subversive element within that colony. And there were quite a lot of young Chinese communist activists that were like university students. They were young intellectuals and whatever, the bright young things. And it was from this particular class, this generation, that the future rulers of Singapore would emerge, but also the future insurgents in Malaya. And this is the point that I was going to get to. If the British made one decision that actually worked out in their favor from a strategic point of view in terms of combating the Japanese after the Japanese had defeated them in Malaya and Singapore by leaving behind an active insurgent element, their incredible foresight was that there was an active military intelligence and SOE element within the British forces. And there were actually British officers that became stay-behinds who continued to work for SOE in Malaya, not really in Singapore, but in Malaya. Just a handful of them, just a few of them, probably less than 4 or 5. But these officers became the crucial agents on the ground in Malaya for what became known as Force 136, which was the SOE task force that was sent out to work from Ceylon, or what's now Sri Lanka and India, coordinating counterinsurgency and resistance in the Japanese rear in Burma and in Thailand, and more crucially, Malaya. And they coordinated it very successfully. They even had radios that were powered by effectively bicycle gyros. And people would be like cycling these bicycle gyros to power a radio that would basically be communicating with their headquarters in Colombo in Sri Lanka. So had this very, very active SOE element that was highly coordinated. And essentially what happened was, as Singapore was falling, somebody essentially was able to get that one of the military intelligence officers was able to get to somebody in British High Command and more or less say, have a round table with both a senior British officer and also the commissioner in Singapore and say, listen, all these Chinese communists that we have languishing in our prisons in Singapore, we need to let them out now. And they say, why would we do that? And they said, because these people, we need to recruit them now. They were our enemies at first, but now they're on our side. They are anti-Japanese. They're anti-Japanese because of what the Japanese have done to the Chinese in China, and particularly their anti-communist ideology. And we need to recruit these, and we need to put them into the field after Singapore falls. And they come to a decision that to release, empty the jails, and they release them out into the general population. And these young Chinese communists end up formulating this mainly Chinese communist-led Malayan resistance, which by the end of the war had all but nearly driven the Japanese out of Malaya. They ran rings around them, and SOE were coordinating the activities. And there were about 80,000 of them, many of them in uniforms with, sort of communist red stars on their helmets and weapons, rifles and everything like that. And they were fully equipped, and they were taking the Japanese on in guerrilla ambushes. And they were a living nightmare for the Japanese to deal with. And one of the crucial things they did, because Malaya produced 80% of the world's supply of rubber. And one of the things they were able to do crucially in the last years of the war was they were able to completely disrupt the production and supply of rubber off those plantations by causing acts of sabotage on the plantations or attacking Japanese supply lines. So they couldn't really get as much rubber out of the plantations as they otherwise would have done. So they caused absolute chaos in the Japanese rear. And at the end of the war, this guerrilla army formed the core of basically the Malayan insurgency that the British then had to defeat. But they eventually did defeat them through coordinating a campaign of hearts and minds. But what ultimately happened was, when it came to basically ending the insurgency and creating peace terms and basically ending the conflict in Malaya, what the British did was they simply brought back in the SOE officers that they had left behind in Malaya and that had been sent in by Colombo. And these same men, they negotiated with the leaders of the Malayan communist insurgency, who were their former comrades from the war. They had worked together during the war. They knew one another. They were on a first name basis. Sometimes when they'd meet for negotiations, they'd give each other a big bear hug. So this is one of the wonderful things. I think it was obviously sad that there was an insurgency in Malaya and that so many people died. But ultimately, this was actually a little bit of a quibble between former comrades. They understood where the other stood. And ultimately, this is an example, one of the few examples other than Crete, of a nearly 100% successful insurgency that actually very nearly drove the occupier out.
Yeah, very interesting, Joe. I just, Lee Kuan Yew, of course, seminal figure for Singapore and, very popular in the United Kingdom. He was fluent in English, had been to Cambridge University, outstanding intellectual. But in 1942, he was 19 or 18 at this point, and he was in Singapore. And he learned Japanese, and he worked as an interpreter for the Japanese occupation forces. But he was not a collaborator. And he said, I got a quote here. So in a radio broadcast made in 1961, Lee Kuan Yew, who was to be the prime minister, the first prime minister of independent Singapore once it split off from the Malaysian Confederation, he said, he emerged from the war. He emerged from the war, determined that no one, neither Japanese nor British, had the right to push and kick us around, and that we could govern ourselves. Now, isn't that an amazing quote and very prescient? And anybody who goes to Singapore now is just impressed about how efficient, how effective, very low crime rate, the coherence despite the multi-ethnic composition of the island. The way they've managed that is an outstanding reflection of the kind of qualities that were reflected by Lee Kuan Yew and the people who, during this terrible period for the Chinese population, not just of Singapore, but right across Indochina, in Malaysia and in Indonesia, where the Chinese were targeted by the Japanese, they emerged in great intact and prepared to make a very considerable contribution in the post-war period. So that's a really tremendous story. Now I'm going to move on to the last talking, which is the Dresden raid. Now, so 4 raids between the 13th and 15th of February 1945. It wasn't just one raid, there were 4. So they did a sequence of bombing raids, 772 heavy bombers of the RAF. Now, try and imagine 772 people in a room, a big room, and these are the bombers, and more than 500 from the US Army Air Force dropped 4,000 tons of HE bombs and incendiary devices. Firestorm destroyed more than 1,600 acres of the city, 6.5 kilometers, so that's about a mile and a half square, maybe 2 miles square of the city center, and up to 25,000 were killed. And of all the bombing raids during the Second World War, the largest mortality rate were the Allied bombing campaign against Japanese cities that started in March 1945. Now, this is February 1945. So in March 1945, the American Air Force principally began its bombing campaign against Japanese cities, and this was to be the most devastating. And of course, it culminated with the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima in August 1945. So we're just talking 6 months after this happened. And so those are the biggest. Then the series of raids in Western Germany, but I think in terms of Western Europe during the Second World War, the single largest, if you classify this raid as a single raid, it's 13, 14, 15, 3 nights, inflicted the largest mortality rate of all the bombing raids by Allied forces against Germany in the Second World War, and the 25,000 people killed. So that's, I think, approaching the number that were killed in the Blitz in Britain, in the whole of the Blitz. And so its legacy is very, and the usual question, I mean, it's been discussed, and I think it's still fairly controversial. The question is, Joe, was this raid absolutely necessary? And did it have to be done in the way that it was? Why did they use incendiaries against a civilian population?
For one very simple reason: to create a firestorm. It's a replication of a tried and tested German tactic. When they started this bombing campaign on Germany, they started bombing Germany obviously around the same time that the Germans started bombing London and other British cities. So it was like tit for tat. But when the British decided to launch a concerted bombing campaign on Nazi Germany, the statement by Churchill was as follows: "We shall bomb Germany by day and by night, making them." This is in 1943. This is when the American bomber offensive, as well as the RAF heavy bombing offensive, starts to really kick in and really start to take effect. The quotation is, "We shall bomb Germany by day and by night, making them taste with every passing night a sharper dose of the miseries that they have showered upon mankind."
So this is revenge.
So this is absolute revenge, and what the RAF Bomber Command are doing, and they're doing. And by the way, Curtis LeMay takes Bomber Command tactics. The big difference between the Americans and the British in the European theater of operations when it comes to aerial warfare is that the Americans want to do strategic bombing by day, and they feel that there's no other way to do it in terms of basically surgically targeting Nazi Germany's industrial sectors, and basically taking out the ball bearings plants, hitting their synthetic oil refineries and oil refineries and their railways and marshalling yards and so on and so forth, all those strategic areas, in order to kind of cripple their war effort and basically affect their supplies. But the issue is that basically the American daylight bombing campaign is not as effective, particularly in 43, as they would like it to be. And the attrition rates are very heavy, and their accuracy is not as good as it should be, given the fact that it's a daylight bombing campaign and they're affected by weather. Whereas the RAF are bombing by night, and they're using technology. They're using radio direction finding, and they're using basically effectively beam tracker technology to actually get to their targets. And they're actually hitting their targets, even though it's bomber streams rather than bomber formations, which is what the Americans are doing with their daylight tactics. The Bomber Command with their bomber streams, are actually hitting their targets with increasing accuracy, almost to the point by the end of the war that they're actually bombing by night and bombing, visually blind, but using their technology, they're actually able to get almost pinpoint accuracy on their targets. They're literally, they have the capacity to orchestrate strategic bombing at night, visually blind, because their technology is that good. But what they're doing in this particular case is they're not doing pinpoint bombing, they're doing area bombing, saturation bombing. And the policy is a policy called dehousing. And it's essentially a refinement of the Luftwaffe tactics that were utilized against Britain from 1940 to 42, but particularly in 1941, when they heavily blitzed a lot of British cities, including Coventry, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Glasgow, and Belfast, Belfast, which is probably, in my view, one of the most devastating blitzes of the entire war, and one that's overlooked. And they started firestorms in these cities. They started a firestorm in London in December 1940. That was the worst blitz that London suffered. And a firestorm consumed most of the city. They barely saved St. Paul's. Belfast was hit by a firestorm twice. the Easter Tuesday Blitz, and then the one that came later at the beginning, sort of end of April, beginning of May. And it was horrific. And what they're doing is they're basically replicating these exact same tactics, but what they're going to do is they're going to multiply their effect. And they're using, at Dresden, they're sort of phasing out the use of Halifax bombers. And they're gradually phasing them out. They are still using them, but they are using increasingly more and more Lancasters, and Lancasters are making up, they make up the majority, like better than 80% of the bomber force that they're using. And there's about 792 bombers that are used by the Royal Air Force on the first night run on Dresden. And that's followed up by about 500 to 600 American bombers, B-17s and B-24 Liberators from all three bomber divisions of the US 8th Air Force in Britain. And they hit Dresden by day as a follow-up. But these 700 to 800 British bombers are Lancasters. They have the largest bomb capacity of any bomber of the entire war. And the Halifaxes that they're using, which are phasing out, have the second highest bomb capacity. They can hold 2/3 of what a Lancaster can hold. And what a Lancaster can hold within its bomb bays is simply, it's mind-bogglingly large bomb loads. We're talking about the equivalent of 250 to 500 pound bombs and racks of incendiaries. A single Lancaster is able to, the primary bomber that the Germans were using for the blitzes of 1941 and 42, which is their go-to bomber, was the Heinkel 111 bomber, and that had the largest bomb capacity of any German bomber. A Lancaster is able to carry 6 times the amount of bombs that a single Heinkel 111 bomber can carry in terms of heavy explosive, high explosive, heavy bombs, which basically blow holes in the earth. If it lands in the middle of a neighborhood, it levels the entire neighborhood. And what happens is the incendiaries fall down more slowly. They're filled with white phosphorus. And what they do is they fall into the ruins of the buildings that have been shattered by the heavy explosive, and they start fires among the timbers of those shattered buildings. And then basically these fires start, these phosphorus fires, the phosphorus within the canisters basically burns at 130 degrees centigrade at very high temperatures. They start fires and it starts sucking all the oxygen, which creates firestorms. And there's actually high velocity winds that are blowing through the city. And in the bombing of Dresden, what essentially happens in many places is that oxygen gets sucked out of every conceivable crevice where people are hiding or taking shelter from these bombing attacks, and people actually die of asphyxiation. They don't all burn to death. Some of them, the oxygen is completely sucked from their lungs, basically to feed the fires.
Yeah, it's a horrific story, Joe, and you can't listen to an account like that without shuddering. Yeah. But the big issue is, I mean, you used a very big word there. You said revenge. I put it in your mouth, but you said revenge. Yeah. Defenders of this operation, Sal, but there was a strategic, there were trains and there were reinforcements going to the Eastern Front and everything else. I mean, are you dismissing that as a justification? Do you think it was, in a way, you're testing new technology? This was an opportunity to test new technologies and see what happened and to demonstrate the terrific power of the technology, but the revenge sentiment, the emotional need to inflict as much injury on Germans, men, women, and children, as possible. So you think that was the primary motivation?
I think when I listen, I'm just going to introduce the audience. This is a puppy, belongs to my girlfriend's daughter. I'm dog sitting the puppy, in case you're wondering what I'm doing. I'm just looking after. Hopefully that will attract more viewers. She's biting my hand at the moment. It's a little bit of humanity, talking about a very grave topic. With regard to Dresden, a lot of people have made the argument that, it was a legitimate target because it was a crucial crossroads. There was a marshalling yard there, and trains were running to the Eastern Front, and also they were pulling troops from the east and sending them west. So it was a crucial juncture in terms of coordinating the war efforts on both the Western and Eastern fronts, as well as the Southern Front as well, Italy. So there's definitely supplies going through Dresden. There's large troop numbers. There's a huge contingent of troops that are moving through Dresden on the night of the raid that are being deployed in theatre, and many of these are fresh. And so the argument has been that, yeah, Dresden was a legitimate target. But then you have to ask yourself, do the ends justify the means? I mean, Robert McNamara, who went on to become Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy administration and later under Johnson, he oversaw the initial part of the Vietnam War in the Johnson administration as Secretary of Defense. Robert McNamara cut his teeth working as a sort of an executive officer on the staff of General Curtis LeMay, when Curtis LeMay was running, I think it was the US 14th, was the 14th or 15th Air Force out in, well, I can't remember the number of the airface. They were based out of the Air Force. They were based out of Tinian and Saipan. These are basically the bombers, the B-29 bombers that were bombing Japan. And before they dropped the atom bombs, they were carpet bombing them, and they were using incendiaries. And I literally got cut off. I was making the point that the Curtis LeMay concluded, having taken part in the daylight air war on Europe, that what the Americans were doing was nuts, and that they should be doing, the Brits were right, we should bomb them by night, and to hell with the civilians and whatever like that, we should just basically level the cities. So Curtis LeMay was bloody minded, and he essentially, what he did was he basically applied Arthur Harris's a bombing strategy, criminal as it might have been in the minds of some American commanders. He applied it to Japan, and he basically used those same tactics, high explosive bombs followed by tons of incendiaries, to basically create firestorms in Tokyo and in other cities and essentially level those cities. And they had effectively incinerated 77 major Japanese cities all across Japan before the atomic bombs were dropped. They had effectively destroyed those cities because they were made of wood. But he was under no illusions as to the moral implications of what they were doing. And he did turn to Robert McNamara and told him, if we had lost the war, Bob, you and I would have been tried as war criminals, and rightly so. So that was his view on what they were doing. He felt that it was the best way to win the war, and he felt it was the most effective and possibly the only way to bring the Japanese to their knees, just like Harris felt that this was the only way to bring the Germans to their knees. But he understood that it was morally wrong. And that's one of the things. I came across a very interesting blog or discussion, and it's related to theology, and I suppose it's the more Catholic worldview. In other words, it connects with just war theory. What is justifiable from a moral sense in terms of, particularly if you're fighting an evil enemy like the Nazis or like the Imperial Japanese were, in terms of the kind of ideologies and the sort of the depravity that is displayed. Can you fight evil with evil? And Catholic teaching is very clear on this particular point, not to preach, but it's very clear. Catholic teaching will tell us that the bombing of Dresden, the bombing of Hamburg, the bombing of Berlin, essentially the tactics used by the RAF, as well as the bombing of those Japanese cities, sort of starting the firestorms in Tokyo, right up to the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is absolutely indefeasible. It's a moral evil and it is never justified. Now, how one squares that with actually winning a war against an enemy as ruthless and as immoral as the Germans and the Japanese, I don't know. But at the same time, when we talk about Dresden, and by the way, Hamburg, the raid on Hamburg, which took place in 1942, over the course of 10 days, this was a continuous round-the-clock bombing campaign that took place over 10 days, absolutely shattering Hamburg. That killed more people than the bombing of Dresden.
Right.
And that was actually when, and that was also like the use of, like, I mean, it was one of the first 1,000 bomber raids that Harris orchestrated. But that's when people knew, that's when people understood, not Dresden, Hamburg was when people understood the extent to which the Allies were going to basically divert away from their moral compass in order to win the war. That's when people knew this, they understood what the moral cost of victory in the war was going to be for the Allied cause. So we should be under no illusions as to how wrong those bombing campaigns were in a moral sense. That is my...
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Obviously in the pre-record we mentioned the Bishop of Chichester was in the House of Lords actually during the war, so the parliamentary life was continuing. No general elections, but parliamentary life was going. There were debates, and he raised the matter in the House of Lords, raised the question, and it continued. There continued to be throughout the war in the United Kingdom, I suspect, also in the United States, but I think the United Kingdom in particular, grave doubts about the morality of what was being done, including in Dresden, and as you mentioned, in Hamburg. My final point on this, and there are people watching this who will watch it, who have family members who served and sacrificed in Bomber Command for the RAF and for the American Air Force. The mortality rate there was absolutely enormous. And of course, if your family member lost a member of their, they lost someone, or they had someone who served, it's a tough one for people to accept that they were involved in something that can be, summed up in the way that you did. But we got to pay due to the service and sacrifice and bravery of these men, largely men, some women.
Yeah.
And I was last week down at Clement Danes Church near King's College, London. And there are two statues, one outside the Clement Danes Church, which is a beautiful church. It's been repaired, but when you go there, it's lovely, it's beautifully maintained. It's a bit of a jewel. At the gateway to the city of London, there's two statues. One is to Downing, and the second one is to Bomber Harris. The Bomber Harris statue came up comparatively. It was only erected quite late, partly because of the points that Joe's making. But I think that's one place you can go if you want to pay respect to the men who served. But maybe the better one is to go to the extraordinary, heroic Bomber Command statue depicting several pilots from Bomber Command at Hyde Park Corner, and that's a really moving place. So we are, when we talk about this subject so glibly, 80 years plus after the events, it's easy for us to express our moral feelings about it, but we also have to take into account the incredible bravery of those who went up night after night after night, and their mortality rate was so high.
Absolutely, yeah. Like, I mean, within RAF Bomber Command alone, and I that's a very important point to make. I mean, no way, it's a moral conundrum, I suppose. But what I'm saying is in no way. I've interviewed Bomber Command veterans. I've interviewed Irish Bomber Command veterans. My grandmother's cousin, Tommy Brennan, served in Bomber Command. He lost his life fighting over Germany. He was shot down over Hamburg in September 43. So I have a personal family connection to Bomber Command and to that campaign. So I'm affected by it too. And there were like nearly 1,000 Irishmen who served as aircrew in Bomber Command who never came home. Their families had no idea what had happened to them. And in total, about 66,000 Bomber Command aircrew were either killed or were missing in action, or became POWs, were shot down. That was those were the casualties and the rate of attrition. 66,000 aircrew members. That's a huge number of aircrew to lose, and that constitutes probably about 10 to 15% of the total number of aircrew the Bomber Command.
I think it may actually have been a higher attrition rate than that.
Yeah. It's a very, well, that's the recorded number. It's about 67,000 were shot down, many of whom were killed. And also what they faced sometimes when they landed was horrendous. There's stories about Bomber Command aircrew basically parachuting down into German cities, and they're parachuting down into cities that have just been hit, just been bombed. There's buildings all around them that are on fire, and the surviving German civilians get them. There's multiple instances of these poor British airmen or Commonwealth British serving airmen been grabbed and basically been thrown into the fires that their bombers had started and basically been burnt alive with these burning German buildings, or been lynched. Horrific stuff.
Yeah, some executed out of hand.
Yeah.
Really horrible story. It's something that, well, the whole conflict is something that makes your blood run colder. It should do. Joe, look, thanks very much for a very engaging talk about two very big topics. The whole Singapore story, I think it's incredibly important moment. And if you know, wherever you are in the world, particularly, you know, if British, you know, as I define myself as of Irish descent, then it's a really sobering moment. But then you look at the bombing campaign and, you know, things like that continue to happen in our lifetime. So, Joe, thanks very much for another really engaging. Oh, you got another point?
Well, I just wanted to convey, there were no comments on the stream, on the YouTube stream tonight, but there was one on Twitter, or X as it's now known, and it was from Timothy Wright. And Timothy Wright says, we can all, when it comes to Singapore, he says, we can all agree that the shorts were a mistake.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah. It doesn't. Yeah, they do look like a bunch of overgrown Boy Scouts, which does unfortunately give a Monty Python tone to really a horrible moment for all the men who were incarcerated, and so many of them died. Joe, thanks very much for everything. We'll have a chat after I close the show. So thanks very much for the moment. And that's it. So we've looked at the second week, roughly, of the February in the Second World War, particular focus on Dresden and Singapore. Hope you found it interesting and enjoyable. We'll be back next week with another edition of This Week in the Second World War. So from everybody here, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.